We have a rapidly aging American population, which means more and more families are grappling with this. And what I still see, unfortunately, after years and years of doing this, is too many families at the point at which a parent, say, has a stroke or a heart attack or falls down and needs help, that people think, oh my God, I don't know what to do. And that distresses me a great deal, because we have figured out over a long period of time what the supports are to help folks in those circumstances. We know we have the map. We can provide them with the map forward and help guide them.
Hey y'all, this is Kosta, and today I'm here with my guest, Dr. Barry J. Jacobs, clinical psychologist, family therapist, and current member of AARP's Caregiving Advisory Panel. Throughout his career, Dr. Jacobs has authored and co-authored dozens of books, journals, and publications, including bestseller, The Emotional Survival Guide for Caregivers. Today, we're talking about coping with caregiver stress and burnout. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Jacobs. I'd like to start this episode with a bit more about your personal journey as a caregiver, how it's shaped you as a clinical psychologist, and ultimately, how it has influenced your life up to this point.
Well, thank you so much for having me here, Kosta. I'm happy to talk with you today. So I grew up in a family where when I was a teenager, my dad had brain cancer and contracted brain cancer when I was 14. And that had an enormous impact on my family's life. I mean, my dad had been an attorney. He had been a litigator. And his first symptom of brain cancer was he lost the power of intelligible speech. So almost overnight, he was not working. My mother had been a homemaker, and then suddenly had to go back to work to work two jobs to try to compensate for the loss of my dad's income to just support the family. And so I saw firsthand at an early age just how illness and disability affect families. My dad died after about a year, and then my family went through some hard economic times and a lot of family dissension. Unfortunately, I saw a lot of conflict between my mother and my father's mother. And it left me with this feeling of my family sort of fell apart during this trial. I grew up then, and I didn't immediately become a clinical psychologist, but I was always interested in the way families are affected by illness and by other adversity. And when I went to graduate school for clinical psychology, I gravitated towards working in medical settings and found that working with families in those settings and as well as in skilled nursing facilities really resonated with me personally. I sort of intuitively understood a lot of what the families were going through, and I really wanted to work hard to help families grow stronger through these trials and not break up the way my family did. And so that kind of led me along a very long path, a 30-plus year path to where I am now.
Do you feel like we've done a good job of protecting that familial core and keeping families together as they navigate this long-term care process since you experienced it?
I think over the last 30 years, we've done a number of different things. We've kind of branded this term family caregiver. I mean, 30 years ago, the term didn't exist. We've created lots of supports within our infrastructure. We have support groups, and we have adult day centers, and we have lots of things that didn't really exist very much 30 years ago. But most of our systems are still very focused on the person who's receiving the care. Family is often an afterthought or marginalized, and sometimes families just considered to be a pain in the neck that the professionals don't want to deal with family members. What I'd love to see, and where I think we're headed, is where family members are really embraced as full partners in care, because among other things, they know their loved ones.
Absolutely.
They're very invested in keeping them at home by and large, or even within facilities. They want to really help them, and they can be a tremendous partner for professionals if we know as professionals how to engage them, how to support them, how to empower them. Those are the three things I always say: engage, support, and empower. And empower means we teach family caregivers how to do their jobs well.
Yeah.
And that's where I think we're headed, especially as since COVID, with this much more awareness of the importance of families play in caring for loved ones who have functional deficits.
Yeah. Throughout your career, you've written extensively on caregiver stress and burnout. Can you walk us through a few of the most common scenarios and symptoms someone might face at the brink of disaster?
Sure. So probably it starts very innocently, right? People say, my father, my mother, they need care. I'm a loving son. I'm going to step up and provide that care. I don't know what that entails, but whatever needs to happen, I'll take care of it. And so people early on start taking on responsibilities, and they may be, rather small responsibilities. They may mow the lawn. They may manage a checkbook. They may buy groceries. They may pick up medications from the pharmacy. But if their parent has a progressive disease, and that could be Parkinson's disease, it could be some form of dementia, then over time they're going to do more and more. And what was a kind of an ironclad commitment at the beginning is still there, but it's now really straining them, because none of us have one role. We're not just children to our parents. Most of us we have our own children, we have spouses, we have jobs, we have neighbors, we have multiple responsibilities. And early on, we can fit in caregiving among those other responsibilities, but over time, caregiving demands more of us and just begins to crowd out our ability to care for others. So when I was in my 50s, I cared for my mom and stepfather, both of whom had significant dementia. My stepfather had Alzheimer's disease. My mom had vascular dementia. And I'm a professional and I'm supposed to know about this stuff, but I went through exactly the same thing, where I said, I'll do whatever it takes to care for them. I moved them up from Florida to live in an apartment a mile from my house and here in Pennsylvania. My wife and I got very involved in feeding them, driving them, all those things. But over time, they needed more and more care. And I basically what ended up happening is I didn't feel like I was doing a good job with them. I didn't feel like I was doing a good job with being a good husband. I wasn't a good father to my teenage children. I wasn't a good worker at my job. And it got to the point where I just felt completely spread thin, washed out, and as you say, burnt out. And so I had to develop some limits on all these different activities to think about what I could realistically manage, because I wasn't superhuman. As much as I wanted to think of myself as superhuman, I wasn't.
Right. And so how did the experience end? Was it did you eventually have to put them in like an assisted living or offer them an assisted living facility?
Eventually, both of them, their degree of dementia progressed to the point that they both went into long-term care facilities at different times.
Was it? Sorry, go ahead.
And I was just going to say, then that of course doesn't end the caregiving journey. It just changes it. And then I was driving 45 minutes to my mom long-term care facility and dealing with the staff there and trying my best to work with it. But sometimes that worked well, sometimes it didn't work well.
Yeah, and there's two things that I want to point out. Number one, and I counter this regularly, and so the fact that you're putting an emphasis on family caregivers and creating sort of a unit as opposed to it just being the individual receiving care. A lot of times, and I say this to most family members that I encounter in the care process, is nobody, no matter what, no matter any condition, 95% of the time are going to be able to provide the kind of care and understand the individual that they're providing care for like a family member will. For example, if I just take it back to like children, no one knows my son or daughter better than I do, right? And it goes to the same aspect with providing care for your parents or a spouse. It's a different type of relationship. And so when did you know that you weren't going to be able, I know you were going through all of these challenges at work, at home. Was there an inflection point where you were just like, I can't do it? Were you driving home one day and you finally were like, I have to consider long-term care facilities at this point?
Well, Kosta, there were two inflection points. So one was, I have a wonderful wife who's also a psychologist, and she basically said to me, "You're doing way too much. You're consumed with guilt. You're very unhappy. I never see you, and our kids never see you, and this can't continue like this." And so she put it that plainly to me, and it made me realize that I was functioning largely out of guilt, and like a lot of caregivers do, unfortunately, and that I needed to find better balance. The other thing, so that was very important. And then the question was how to find the right balance, how to put in. I mean, I was still responsible to care for them, but the question was whether I was going to do it all myself or whether I was going to hire home health aides and other folks to assist with that, which is what we eventually did. But the other inflection point was, I would be at work, and my job happened to be literally 1.5 miles from where my mother and stepfather were living, and my stepfather fell a lot. And so I would get calls from my mother while I was at work saying, "He fell again. Can you come over and pick him up? Otherwise, I got to call the fire department."
Yeah.
And the fire department was sick of hearing from them. And I would leave work. I would bust it over to their house as quickly as I could. I would rush upstairs. I would pick them up, put them on the couch, and rush out again and get back to work to try to get back to whatever meeting I had been in. And it just got to a point where it just was way too much. I couldn't do it. And then I couldn't. A lot of times when I would go to their apartment, I couldn't just pick him up and leave because there was, I had to make sure he was not hurt. I had to make sure my mother was calmed down. There was it really began to intrude on my work life.
Absolutely. So this is an important question. In your book, The Emotional Survival Guide for Caregivers, you discuss the importance of setting realistic expectations. What do these expectations normally look like, and how can we better measure and manage the stress we're facing as caregivers?
So in my chapter in that book that you're referring to is called Defining Commitments. And so, as I just was saying in my own case, I was committed to caring for my mother and stepfather. Most caregivers I meet have made that commitment. So it's not the goal here is not in question. What's in question is how we reach that goal. And there's lots of different ways to provide good care. And no care needs to be perfect. It just needs to be good enough. And so setting limits or defining commitments is a matter of defining what I'm willing and able to do, and what I'm willing, able, and available to do, and what I'm not willing, able, or available to do. And so, for instance, I was committed to making sure my mom was well fed, to get her into the doctor's appointments, try to provide some sort of entertainment, social life for her. But as her son, I wasn't going to shower her, right? And after a while, she wasn't safe in the shower anymore. I had a different set of expectations and defined commitments differently for my stepfather because I had a different relationship with him. Sure. But it didn't mean I was letting either of them down. It just meant that I was going about caring for them with other choices, bringing other people in to do things that I wasn't willing, able, and available to do.
You were a clinical psychologist, so I can imagine just by sort of thinking out loud that you probably got a pen and paper out and really, went pros and cons, or maybe, said, okay, this is what I can do, this is what I can't do. What about all those people that just, like you were saying earlier, kind of rush headfirst into this and just incredibly difficult decision, and they find themselves overwhelmed, overworked? How did you really keep from falling into that trap, or did you, in your opinion?
I think early on I did. I made a course correction, which made a big difference. I didn't make choices that for instance, my mom was entirely, satisfied with. I mean, for instance, she didn't want a home health aide with her 7 days a week. She needed a home health aide 7 days a week because there were times when she didn't have a home health aide. If I came over to her apartment and let myself in, I would find her on the floor that she had fallen and she was there for a few hours. And I, in good conscience, I couldn't allow that to occur. So against her wishes, sometimes I would say, no, if I'm not going to be here, you need someone else here. In talking with clients about this, and as you say, this comes up a lot, I use a very stereotypical metaphor. I use the caregiver marathon metaphor, but I stretch the marathon metaphor just as far as it could possibly be stretched. So I talk about how there are a number of things caregivers need to do, and that is if you're running a marathon, you need to know the course. You need to have a little bit of a sense of the lay of the land. That means educating yourself about what your loved one's condition is, and what their likely condition will be in the future, and what treatments and supports exist. You need to gain support. Nobody runs a marathon by themselves. They run marathons with shoulder to shoulder with people that helps them go further. So that's a question of getting support. You have people on the sideline cheering for you. You usually are able to go further. And no one runs past the water station at mile 3 and says, no, thank you, I'm not thirsty, because that would mean they would never be able to, they would be completely dehydrated before they got through half the race. So the idea here is I use this metaphor to basically paint the picture of, if you want to get from beginning to end, there are certain things you need to do. You need to pace yourself. You need to get support. You need to educate yourself. If you can do those things, then you will achieve that goal of crossing that finish line. If you don't do those things, then you're much more likely to have to stop in the middle of a race, which will be tremendous disappointment to you and maybe a disappointment to other people, including the person you're caring for.
Yeah, you don't skip the water station at mile 3 unless you want to blow up at mile 8.
That's exactly right. But unfortunately, kind of metaphorically speaking, a lot of times when I work with caregivers, they say, no, I don't need help. That the person I'm caring for needs the attention and help. I'm fine. Yeah. When in fact, it's better for people to replenish themselves at every opportunity all along the way, even early on when they may not think that they deserved any kind of replenishment.
So let's talk about something specific. Sleep deprivation can exacerbate stress and burnout for both those giving care and receiving it. What strategies can caregivers use to improve their sleep quality and quantity?
It's a great question because it's not just caregivers. I mean, half of America has sleep issues. So, when I have this conversation with a caregiver, is one of the first things I talk with them about is what's basically called sleep hygiene. Sleep hygiene are some basic sleep habits. So you go to sleep in a room which is quiet, where there's very little light. You go to sleep at the same time every night and wake up at the same time every morning, because we need to set our
circadian rhythm.
Circadian rhythm. Thank you. I was searching for that term. We need to refrain from using alcohol to help us get to sleep, because alcohol as a drug, it keeps you asleep for 4 hours, and then 4 hours later you're wide awake. And then lots of caregivers worry, and it's worry that often interferes with their ability to initiate sleep. And so I talk with them about how you're not going to prevent yourself from worrying, because oftentimes there are things you need to worry about. But you don't accomplish anything by worrying as you're trying to get to sleep. So why don't we schedule some worry, like an hour of worrying or a half hour of worrying earlier on in the day?
Great idea.
You can worry to your heart's delight, and then later on, when you've written things down that need to get done, you don't have to review all that while you rehearse it in your mind as you're trying to go to sleep and have it interfere with your sleep. So there's lots of different strategies I use with folks, and then frankly, there may be the need for medical intervention if their sleep problems are persistent, and there are like 5 or 6 different classes of drugs for insomnia. They all have their pros and cons, but what the idea is to use medication to not to become dependent on the medication, but to reset the sleep cycle, reset that circadian rhythm, so people can get back into a kind of normal pattern of sleep. The other thing I'm just going to say is, most Americans will tell you they need 5 to 6 hours of sleep. From a biological perspective, most human beings need 7 to 8 hours of sleep. Caregivers need 7 to 8 hours of sleep. People are going to say that's not possible. I'm going to say then ultimately what happens if you're sleep deprived, you'll be more irritable during the day. You won't be able to concentrate as well. You'll be more likely to get depressed, and you're not going to be as good a caregiver. And so sleep is one of the most essential self-care activities we have.
And if I can mention one more thing on the topic of sleep is you shouldn't use these egregious amounts of melatonin supplements that are on the market right now. I mean, so NPR, literally, Fresh Air was talking about this yesterday, and I was listening to it, so it's interesting that we're having this discussion. Your body produces like 0.2% melatonin when you're sleeping. And so imagine if you take 10 milligrams, it's like hundreds of percent higher than what your body is naturally producing. And so, of course, you may become dependent on being able to produce that melatonin to the level that you're receiving it through those supplements. But it's like you said, 50% of the country has issues with sleeping enough, falling asleep in general. And it must be even more when you're being a family caregiver.
I think that's true for any stressful time in our lives. We have more difficulty sleeping, but the act of going to sleep is not like flipping a switch and like suddenly you're out and 8 hours later you wake up.
Sure.
It takes some good habits. It takes some thoughtfulness to do this well. And especially as people get older, they may not sleep as readily as they did when they were younger. And so they have to be strategic about it in some of the ways that we're talking about today.
So many caregivers experience feelings of guilt or inadequacy, especially when they need to take time for themselves. How can they work through these emotions and start honoring the importance of self-care?
This is obviously the $64,000 question. This is the one that everybody struggles with. And you heard me say I struggled with it too. Mm-hmm. So what I would say is, going back to that marathon metaphor, it's a question of how far can you realistically go? We can't will ourselves across the finish line if we're completely depleted and exhausted. And so as a plan to be the very best caregiver you can be, self-care becomes, integral to that. And that includes taking time for yourself. And taking time for yourself it's like people have this idea that this is a kind of zero-sum game. When I take time for myself, I'm taking it away from the person who really needs my care. And it's not a zero-sum game. When I take time for myself to read a book, to go walking with friends, to work out at a gym, then that provides me with not less energy, but more energy to bring to caregiving. And it's actually additive. It helps me be a better caregiver. It helps me caregive with greater patience, with more energy, with maybe better sense of humor. There's lots of good things to recommend about it. So it improves caregiving. It doesn't detract from caregiving.
Yeah. Dr. Jacobs, this feels taboo to talk about because we like to think about the care process as a magical land where nothing goes wrong and everybody is working together. But what's your advice for dealing with loved ones who may be uncooperative or resistant to care?
We could talk about this for hours upon hours. This is, as a psychologist in caregivers, this is primarily what we talk about. We talk about conflict with the person you're caring for, sometimes conflict with other family members, very frequently conflict with adult siblings who have parents that they're caring for. And so there are different strategies for each of these relationships. What I would say is, the goal here is to have folks pulling in the same direction. There's you're not going to always agree. As a matter of fact, I will guarantee you're not going to always agree.
Right.
There are lots of older adults in particular that are very resistant to accepting care because it's a loss of pride and dignity for them to suddenly have greater dependency on you or on other family members. So we have to approach them with as much empathy as we can, and we have to ask them for their permission and their blessing to care for them. but we also want to make sure that they maintain as much control and therefore dignity over their lives as possible. So we're always striking that balance with other family members who you'd like to pull onto the caregiving team who are resistant to doing that. I'm a little bit of a kind of a direct guy, and I'm always of the mind that you basically say, I really need you to do this for me.
Mm-hmm.
You may have whatever your feelings are about mom or dad. I need you to do this for me because because I need this for our relationship. And if you don't do this for me, then unfortunately our relationship's going to suffer in the future. Yeah. And I put it very plainly. That sometimes is a hard pill for folks to swallow. They don't want to be that direct. But if folks who are considering who are reluctant to join the caregiving team understand this is not that they're making a choice which has ramifications. Everybody remembers who was there in mom's hour of need. Everybody remembers those things forever, 20 years, 30 years. And that's their choice now matters. And so that they need to be put on notice that they're making a choice. If they step up, it strengthens the family relationships. If they hang back or even withdraw completely, it weakens the family relationships. And so I try to put it plainly like that and let the chips fall where they may.
How do you reconcile when you talk to people about that loss of control? Because, the identity, the ideological identity of being an American is that you are an individual and that you kind of make it your way, come hell or high water, I'm going to do it. And when you age, it seems like it's oxymoronic to what we've been taught our entire life, or counterintuitive, I'm sorry, to what we've been taught our entire life, that, hey, now you're in this totally different dynamic when it comes to relating to the rest of the American population, because you are in that, and I'll make it brief, but you're in this aging category. And the aging category, they're not producing for the capitalistic machine. They're retired essentially, and the services that they are going to receive are usually very, very expensive and require a lot of sacrifices to be made from the family standpoint and from their own standpoint, economically and socially.
I mean, this is hard, but here's how I go about this. So proud older adult, proud guy who
sure
been the breadwinner in his family and has been the patriarch and now is on the receiving end of care and doesn't want to be a burden to his children, doesn't want to interfere with their lives, with their marriages, with his care needs. So I'll say to him, when you were your daughter's age, did you care for your parents? And almost invariably they'll say, yeah, I did. And I say, well, how did that go? And what was that like for you? And
mm-hmm.
Did your parents receive that help from you graciously, or did they fight you the whole time? And so that often gives them pause about some of the decisions that they're making. The other thing is I talk a lot about receiving graciously, that if you receive great help graciously from your daughter, that's a gift for her because you are enabling her to step into a role of greater maturity and maybe greater sense of competence. And you're demonstrating to her as well that what it is like to age and to be, have gratitude and to allow others to do for you and to allow yourself to be humble. That those are all very powerful life lessons. And I say to folks, are those lessons you'd like to share with your daughter? Would they be important to her? Or alternatively, the lesson you want to show her is, no, you begrudge others from trying to help you constantly and push people away. Is that what you want to show? So go ahead.
That was an excellent explanation. Probably, and to be quite honest, one of the best explanations that I've had to that question. And I've asked that question often. So I hope that people listen to this and pick up, if anything, that specific explanation, because that was perfect.
Well, Costa, that sounds good, but it's only as good as it works, and it only works maybe 20 to 30% of the time. So, I mean,
Well, I mean, it's a compartmentalized system to begin with. So these little 20 and 30% hopefully make up 100%, right?
It's an ongoing progression, and sometimes people will put up a very strong front against receiving help early on, and then they basically will allow people to do a little bit. It's sort of like it's that old foot in the door kind of salesmanship technique. Once the daughter can bring over, dinner once a week for her dad, and then her dad will allow her to come over twice a week with dinner, and maybe have to have the grandchildren stop by and do some work around the house, and but you start really small and hope that there's not a loss of face that blocks that first step in the door.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the hardest parts of being a caregiver is you feel forgotten, and sometimes you start to forget even yourself. How can we support and uplift the caregivers in our life and show them the appreciation that they deserve?
Well, I think as a society, we've done a better job of just recognizing caregivers. I mean, I think there's more and more attention to their needs, especially caregivers of specific disorders like dementia. But I also think that within our own families, we need to look to the folks that are providing care to people we care about. We need to show up and help them best we can, because they're doing really important work, and that work needs to be valued. Caregivers often feel isolated when they feel that others have withdrawn from them, almost as if what they're doing is contagious, that their loved one's illness or disability is going to affect other people, but also because they're not in the mainstream of life anymore. They're off on this kind of byway that no one really wants to go. But by going there and supporting them and valuing them, caregivers are able to sustain themselves so much better, and that matters tremendously. And again, caregivers remember who stepped up, who was there, and who wasn't there, who pulled back, and who really was there, praising them, patting them on the back, maybe providing material support, helping with hard tasks. All that matters.
Before we wrap up, I want to ask you: do you feel? You work in policy, you work with AARP, you're in the long-term care space day in and day out. Do you feel optimistic about the future?
I mean, that's a really complicated question, Kosta. So
extremely complicated.
Yeah. So I'll give you the short answer. We have a rapidly aging American population, which means more and more families are grappling with this. And what I still see, unfortunately, after years and years of doing this, is too many families at the point at which a parent, say, has a stroke or a heart attack or falls down and needs help, that people think, oh my God, I don't know what to do. And that distresses me a great deal, because we have figured out over a long period of time what the supports are to help folks in those circumstances. We know we have the map. We can provide them with the map forward and help guide them. So my hope is, I'm optimistic that we'll be able to, that as public awareness of caregiving increases, we'll be able to let more people know that they're not alone, that there are supports to help them. The supports are not perfect, but they're helpful. And I also believe that the supports will become more sophisticated, more effective with time, and that so that, again, people will not feel as overwhelmed by this very wonderful commitment that they're making to care for someone that they care about, that someone loves. So I'm optimistic in all those respects, and we have a long way to go.
Good. I'm optimistic as well. There's strength in numbers, guys.
For sure.
So we always like to end the show with a call to action. What's one piece of actionable advice you believe can bring a caregiver closer to a balanced and fulfilling caregiving experience?
It's less action and more reflection, but what it is I want caregivers to practice greater self-kindness. I want them to not be so critical of who they are, to not be, consequently not be so prone to guilt, and to not feel compelled to do certain caregiving tasks on their own when there are better solutions and easier solutions available. And so when people can appreciate that they're doing the best that they can, and their best is good enough, and that they don't have to be perfect, then the caregiving is generally more sustainable, and they kind of naturally gravitate towards having better balance in their lives. When people are extremely self-critical and feel very guilty and then hold themselves to sometimes impossible standards, then their life is completely out of balance, and they're much more likely to burn out.